Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander into a corner of history that is, well, let's just say awkward to explain if you're trying to keep things family-friendly. But don't worry, we'll keep the lighting low, the tone soft, and the pacing nice and slow, because this is boring history for sleep, not a Netflix shock doc. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe tuck yourself in, and let's drift back to a time when the greatest empires of the world relied heavily on a very particular kind of servant, a servant who was considered trustworthy not because of loyalty, not because of moral integrity, but because, let's just say, the knife had been involved. Yes, tonight we are talking about the eunuchs. The men who were cut out of certain possibilities in life, and who, paradoxically, were then handed the keys to the palace, the treasury, the harem, and sometimes the empire itself. Now, if you've ever thought your job was weird, spare a thought for the eunuch, because their career path usually began with a brutal operation, ended with some strange mix of fear and envy, and in between, they became the shadow administrators of some of the biggest empires in history. Let's start floating gently into the story. The earliest eunuchs. The earliest written mentions of eunuchs pop up in ancient Mesopotamia. That's Iraq, give or take, thousands of years ago. And, as you might guess, the practice was never about medical necessity. It was always about control. Rulers in ancient empires had one recurring problem. Who do you trust around your wives, your concubines, your daughters, and all the highly strategic wombs of the palace? Because in a society where dynasties were everything, one accidental pregnancy could topple a dynasty faster than a badly aimed catapult. And so, some clever administrator had the bright idea. What if we staffed the palace with men who physically could not make babies? Then you wouldn't have to worry about little side projects happening behind the curtains. This was the beginning of the eunuch tradition. And once rulers realized they could use this system, it spread like wildfire. By the time we get to the Assyrian Empire, roughly 900 BCE, eunuchs were already the backbone of court life. They weren't just guarding harems either. They were generals, advisors, tax collectors. Some Assyrian kings trusted eunuchs more than their own brothers, which, if you know anything about ancient monarchies, was probably wise. Brothers had a way of murdering you in the sleep. So the eunuchs became this paradoxical class of men who were technically less than whole, but politically absolutely vital. Now here's the irony. Eunuchs were prized not only because they couldn't impregnate anyone, they were also considered less likely to build dynasties of their own. In the ruthless logic of monarchy, that made them useful. Think about it. If you were a king and you handed power to your cousin would try to keep that power for his children. But a eunuch, he couldn't produce heirs. No sons, no grandsons, no great-grandsons, just a dead end. So kings assumed that meant eunuchs would stay loyal. They had no one to scheme for, no one to inherit their wealth or rank, at least in theory. In practice, of course, human beings are endlessly creative at finding ways to accumulate power and wealth, even when biology has been, let's say, tampered with. Eunuchs couldn't pass things to their own children, but they certainly could pass favors to nephews, cousins, adopted sons, or even just bribe their way into immortality with monuments. Still, the perception remained.
And so, from Mesopotamia to Persia to Byzantium to China, rulers kept appointing eunuchs. The Persian Empire and court eunuchs. Now let's slide into the Achaemenid Persian Empire. We're talking Cyrus the Great, Darius, Xerxes, all the names that show up in school textbooks right before your eyes glazed over. By this point, eunuchs were everywhere in the palace. They managed the royal household, they guarded the harem, they supervised palace finances. And of course, they were the only men allowed near the royal women, which, if you were a queen or a princess in Persia, meant your life was basically surrounded by an entourage of eunuchs. Greek historians who loved gossip wrote about this constantly. They painted the Persian court as decadent, filled with silken robes, perfumed halls, and eunuchs whispering secrets. Now, how much of that is true and how much is Greek propaganda is debatable. The Greeks thought Persians were soft for having elaborate palaces, so they often exaggerated. But the eunuchs, oh, they were very real. And it's here that we start to see the other side of the story. Eunuchs were not just passive servants, they could be kingmakers. When you control the palace doors, the treasury, and the flow of gossip, suddenly you're one of the most powerful people in the empire.
Eunuchs as political players. One of the weirdest things about eunuchs in history is how many of them ended up running governments from the shadows. Take Bagoas, for example. He was a Persian court eunuch in the 4th century BCE. He rose from being a palace servant to basically controlling the throne. He poisoned King Artaxerxes III, manipulated the succession, and for a while ran the empire like a puppeteer. The irony is almost poetic. The very men who were physically mutilated to make them harmless ended up being some of the most dangerous political figures around. And this pattern repeats everywhere. Byzantium, eunuchs ran half the government. China, same story, but on steroids. The Ming dynasty practically lived in fear of its own eunuchs. But we'll float toward those tales in later parts. For now, just notice the contradiction. The eunuchs were trusted because they supposedly had nothing to gain, and yet they gained everything. The social awkwardness. Now, while we're drifting along, let's not ignore the obvious. Being a eunuch wasn't exactly glamorous from the start. Most eunuchs weren't born into privilege. They were usually boys taken as slaves, often from conquered regions, and then forcibly castrated. Some families even sold their sons into this fate, either out of poverty or ambition. And yes, there were different methods of castration, and none of them are bedtime story material. Some involve just removing the testes, others the whole apparatus. The more extreme version was more highly valued in certain courts, because, again, no accidents in the harem. So you have to imagine the trauma involved here, and yet for some of these men, the operation opened doors. A peasant boy with no prospects could suddenly become the confidant of an emperor. A slave could become a general. Which brings us to one of the strangest things about eunuch history. It was both tragedy and opportunity. A life cut short in one sense, but expanded in another. Let's pause here in this dimly lit palace hallway of the past. In Part 2, we'll drift into the Byzantine Empire and imperial China, where eunuchs reached their absolute peak of influence, sometimes ruling entire dynasties from behind the curtains. So settle in. The night is long, and eunuchs, as it turns out, have a lot more history than you probably expected.
Welcome back. Still cozy? Still awake? Or maybe drifting in and out, which honestly is the point. Either way, let's slide further along the eunuch trail, and this time we're wandering into Byzantium. Byzantium, the empire that refused to die.
Technically, the Eastern Roman Empire, it lasted for over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome in the West. Rome collapses in 476 CE. Byzantium just shrugs, paints some more mosaics, and keeps going until 1453. And through all of those centuries, the eunuchs were right there, shuffling quietly through marble corridors, carrying scrolls, jingling keys, and whispering into emperors' ears. Why Byzantium loved eunuchs. So why did the Byzantines love eunuchs so much? Well, the same basic reasons as before: trust, dynasties, control of women's quarters. But Byzantium took the whole idea and refined it into an actual system. See, Byzantium had this obsession with ceremonial hierarchy. Everyone had a title, everyone had a special hat. If you sneezed in the wrong direction, you needed the correct ceremonial sleeve to do it. And eunuchs fit perfectly into this hyper-bureaucratic world. They became their own class, not just servants, but a whole recognized group within society. Eunuchs could hold offices, command armies, even become patriarchs of the church. The only thing they couldn't do was become emperor. And even then, there were loopholes. So instead of being seen as half-men or rejects, eunuchs in Byzantium were everywhere. They were in the palace, the treasury, the military. The Byzantines basically said, yes, you're missing some bits, but here's a gold chain and a job title. Congratulations. Now, it's worth pausing to picture how eunuchs were seen. Byzantine art often depicted them with a kind of eternal boyishness. No beards, smooth features, sometimes slightly softer or androgynous looks. In a society where masculinity was often defined by facial hair and battle scars, eunuchs were visually set apart. This gave them a strange aura, almost like liminal beings, neither fully men in the social sense nor women. They were other. And because they were other, people projected all sorts of mystical qualities onto them. Some thought eunuchs were closer to angels. Others thought eunuchs were sneaky devils. Either way, they were never boring. Basil the eunuch, the man behind the throne. Now, one of the best examples comes from the 9th century. Basil the eunuch, not to be confused with Basil the Macedonian, who was emperor. Basil the eunuch was a court official who climbed so high in rank that even emperors had to bow to his influence. He was the parakoimomenos, literally the guy who slept beside the emperor. Now, don't get excited, it wasn't romantic. It meant he was the chamberlain, the man who guarded the emperor's bedchamber at night, which meant, effectively, no one could reach the emperor without going through Basil first. You can see where this is going. If you wanted access, favors, or power, you had to go through the eunuch at the bedroom door. That is an absurd amount of soft power, and Basil wielded it for decades. In fact, the position of parakoimomenos became one of the most powerful offices in Byzantium, and it was almost always held by a eunuch. Now, here's where things get amusing. Christianity, officially, wasn't supposed to be a fan of castration. The Bible has some fairly clear opinions on it. But Byzantium was a Christian empire, and yet eunuchs kept rising. How'd they get around this? Well, technically, men who were born that way could enter the clergy, and some who weren't born that way, well, people suddenly developed very convenient stories about accidents involving wild animals or illnesses. So yes, loopholes were found. And soon, eunuchs were not just running palaces, they were running churches. A eunuch patriarch of Constantinople wasn't unheard of. It's one of those delightful historical contradictions where theology bent to politics. Because who else was going to keep the palace functioning?
The military eunuchs. It's easy to think eunuchs were elected court officials, but many of them were also generals. The Byzantines didn't see castration as disqualifying someone from battle. In fact, some of their most successful commanders were eunuchs. Take Narses, a eunuch general under Justinian in the 6th century. He led armies against the Ostrogoths in Italy and basically reconquered half the Western Empire. He was brilliant, ruthless, and terrifying in battle, and yes, also a eunuch. There's a certain irony in that, isn't there? Imagine being an Ostrogoth warrior, charging into battle full of macho rage, only to be outmaneuvered by a man your culture would have considered unmanly. History has a sense of humor. The gossip factor. Of course, with power comes gossip. Eunuchs in Byzantium were often accused of scheming, plotting, and being the whispering devils behind the throne. Some of this was probably true. Some of it was just scapegoating. It's always convenient to blame the eunuchs when things go wrong. They were, after all, visibly different, which meant they could be painted as sinister. Byzantine chroniclers loved to describe them as snake-like, effeminate, or corrupt. But those same chroniclers also admitted, usually grudgingly, that emperors couldn't function without them. So it was this constant push and pull. Fear them, but also depend on them. Mock them, but also promote them. A world without legacy. One of the most melancholy aspects of eunuch history in Byzantium is that for all their power, they rarely left behind family legacies. They could be wealthier than nobles, more powerful than generals, more trusted than princes. But when they died, their line ended. Some adopted heirs. Some passed fortunes to monasteries. Others just vanished from the record, as if all their power dissolved the moment they were gone. In a world obsessed with dynasties, that must have been a haunting reality. To climb so high, only to leave no descendants to remember your name. Let's pause the march of time here. We've seen how Byzantium turned eunuchs into a permanent fixture of empire, powerful, trusted, resented, and oddly essential. In Part 3, we'll drift eastward into China, where eunuchs became an unstoppable political force, sometimes ruling entire dynasties from the shadows, and sometimes plunging them into chaos. So stay cozy. The story isn't done. The empire of the eunuchs still has many palaces left to walk through.
So here we are, entering imperial China. And if you thought the Byzantines were obsessed with eunuchs, buckle up. Or rather, relax deeper into your pillow, because China elevated the eunuch system into something colossal. For over 2,000 years, from the Han Dynasty all the way to the Ming, eunuchs weren't just palace staff, they were practically an institution. They became kingmakers, warlords, cultural patrons, and, let's be honest here, the nightmare of Confucian bureaucrats everywhere. Why China needed eunuchs? Let's start with the basics. Chinese emperors had harems, enormous harems, hundreds, sometimes thousands of women, all theoretically available to produce heirs. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm an emperor and my entire dynasty depends on making sure nobody sneaks into the harem uninvited, yeah, I'm hiring eunuchs too. So at first, their role was the same as elsewhere, guarding the palace women, maintaining the inner court, keeping the imperial household running smoothly. But here's the twist. The Chinese imperial system was famously suspicious of hereditary nobility. The Confucian scholar officials were chosen through exams, which theoretically gave talented men from across the empire a chance at power. But they weren't allowed into the inner palace. That was eunuch territory. So this meant that eunuchs and scholar officials developed a permanent rivalry. Imagine two groups of bureaucrats glaring at each other across the Forbidden City. On one side, Confucian exam nerds waving scrolls about morality. On the other, eunuchs, jingling keys to the emperor's bedroom. Guess which group usually won? The Han Dynasty. Eunuchs enter the stage. The Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE to 200 CE, is where eunuchs in China really started making a splash. At first, they were just servants, but soon they realized the emperor was young, the court was chaotic, and the scholar officials were boring old men quoting Confucius. So the eunuchs stepped in as advisors. And then, as often happens, they didn't step back out. By the later Han Dynasty, eunuchs weren't just advising emperors, they were controlling them. The infamous 10 attendants were a clique of powerful eunuchs who basically ran the empire during the 2nd century CE. They became so hated that they were slaughtered in palace coups multiple times. But the cycle kept repeating. Kill one group of eunuchs, another would rise again. It was like palace weeds. You could chop them down, but they'd sprout again, whispering into the next emperor's ear. Tang Dynasty. Eunuchs with armies. Now, let's float to the Tang Dynasty, one of the golden ages of Chinese history, 7th to 10th centuries. Art, poetry, trade, silk, Buddhism, all the things that make documentaries sigh with admiration. And yet, behind the glittering Tang facade, eunuchs were quietly taking control of the military. Yes, military. By the 8th century, Tang emperors trusted eunuchs more than generals. Generals had armies, and armies could rebel. Eunuchs, however, were thought to have no dynastic ambitions. Sound familiar? So emperors handed them command of imperial guards. Before long, eunuchs weren't just guarding the palace, they were leading troops, controlling garrisons, and deciding who lived and who didn't. By the late Tang period, they were effectively running the empire's defense, which is a nice way of saying they were in charge. And just to add to the bedtime irony, this led to one of the most famous coups in Chinese history. In 903 CE, the eunuchs staged what was called the Sweet Dew Incident. They tried to eliminate their rivals by literally ambushing them in the palace. It failed spectacularly and led to their massacre. But don't worry, more eunuchs would rise again. Because, of course they did.
Ming Dynasty, the peak and the disaster. If the eunuchs of Byzantium were powerful, and the eunuchs of the Tang were militarized, then the eunuchs of the Ming Dynasty were unstoppable. The Ming, 14th to 17th centuries, perfected the art of eunuch rule. Emperors, often isolated in the Forbidden City, relied heavily on them. Eunuchs became ministers, generals, spies, secret police, yes, actual secret police. The most infamous eunuch of the Ming was Wei Zhongchen in the early 1600s. He rose from a fairly obscure background to become the de facto ruler of China. He was so powerful that officials literally wrote odes to him. Temples were built in his honor, and anyone who opposed him usually ended up very dead. He is often remembered as the ultimate example of eunuch tyranny, which admittedly sounds like the title of a heavy metal album, but was less fun in reality. His downfall came only after the emperor who favored him died, and suddenly the entire bureaucracy pounced. But before Wei, there was Zhang He, the famous eunuch admiral who sailed massive treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean in the 15th century. Imagine it, a castrated palace servant from Yunnan suddenly commanding the largest navy the world had ever seen. 7 voyages stretching to Africa. Zhang He was the proof that eunuchs could rise not only within the palace, but also onto the world stage. So while eunuchs in China often became symbols of corruption, they could also be cultural heroes. That duality is part of what makes their history so oddly fascinating. Eunuchs versus scholars. It's worth emphasizing again the great rivalry, eunuchs versus Confucian officials. Confucians hated eunuchs.
They wrote endless memorials complaining that eunuchs were corrupt, immoral, scheming, and destroying the empire, which was sometimes true, to be fair. But the eunuchs shot back by reminding everyone that Confucians were stuffy, arrogant, and obsessed with quoting old books instead of actually running things. This tension became a recurring theme. If you see a Chinese dynasty collapsing, chances are someone will eventually blame the eunuchs. It became a cliché of dynastic decline. Ah yes, the empire fell because of eunuch corruption. It's neat, it's tidy, and it's not entirely accurate, but good enough for a bedtime story. The Forbidden City and the Eunuch World. In the Ming and Qing dynasties, the Forbidden City became the ultimate eunuch zone. Thousands of eunuchs lived and worked there, running every aspect of palace life. Some estimates suggest that during the height of the Ming, there were around 70,000 eunuchs in service. 70,000! That's not a side group, that's a small city of eunuchs. They had their own internal hierarchy, their own training schools, even their own secret police force. They managed food, clothing, rituals, and of course the harem. For an emperor shut away in the palace, eunuchs were his daily companions, his gatekeepers, and sometimes his only friends. And when emperors were weak or disinterested, eunuchs filled the vacuum, which is how entire dynasties ended up being steered by castrated officials in silk robes. Now, as much as some eunuchs rose to glory, most did not. The majority of palace eunuchs lived quiet, invisible lives, polishing floors, carrying trays, managing endless rituals. Many were recruited as boys, often from poor families, sometimes sold by their parents. The surgery was brutal, survival rates weren't great, and those who made it faced a life of obedience. Only a handful ever reached the heights of Zheng He or Wei Zhongchen. And like in Byzantium, they left no families behind. Their names faded, their graves unvisited. Their service was their entire existence, and when they were gone, the empire just moved on. Let's pause here, in the echoing courtyards of the Forbidden City, surrounded by silent eunuchs bustling through shadowed corridors. In Part 4, we'll wander into the Ottoman world, where eunuchs ran the harems and plotted in palaces along the Bosphorus. Another empire, another whispers in the dark. So keep the blanket tucked in. The night is long, and the eunuchs are far from finished.
So here we are in Istanbul, though at the time it was Constantinople, freshly conquered in 1453 by Mehmet the Conqueror. The Ottomans weren't just inheritors of empire, they were collectors of ideas. They borrowed from Byzantium, Persia, and the Islamic caliphates before them. And yes, they borrowed the eunuch system too. But the Ottomans didn't just copy-paste the concept. They took eunuchs and gave them a starring role in one of the most famous palace institutions in the world, the harem. Black eunuchs and white eunuchs. The Ottomans had a neat little system. Eunuchs were divided into two broad groups, black eunuchs and white eunuchs. The white eunuchs were usually European boys, often from the Balkans, taken through the devshirme system. These were Christian boys converted to Islam, some of whom were castrated and set to work in the palace. They were stationed mostly at the outer palace and administrative posts. The black eunuchs, on the other hand, were typically enslaved Africans, castrated before being brought to Istanbul. They were placed in charge of the inner palace, especially the harem. Over time, the black eunuchs rose in prestige until they were considered far more powerful than their white counterparts. So you had this racial divide, layered over a castration divide, layered over a palace hierarchy. The Ottoman court was nothing if not complicated. The chief black eunuch, the Kizlar Haga,
This man wasn't just guarding doors. He was one of the empire's top officials, responsible for supervising the imperial harem, controlling access to the sultan's family, and managing huge charitable foundations across the empire. And yes, he controlled staggering amounts of money. Vast sums intended for mosques, schools, and endowments flowed through his office. And let's just say, when you're handling that much cash, the temptation to skim a little, or a lot, was never far away. Eunuchs and the harem. Now, let's talk about the harem. Westerners have long imagined it as a kind of sultry paradise filled with lounging women and scented oils. In reality, it was more like a heavily guarded, politically charged daycare for dynastic survival. The harem was where future sultans were raised, where the sultan's mother schemed, and where alliances were forged. It wasn't just about romance. It was about succession. And who was managing the daily logistics of this world? The eunuchs. They controlled which concubines were favored, who gained access to the sultan, and how information flowed between the inner palace and the outer palace. The eunuchs were the silent mechanics of Ottoman dynastic power.
Rivalries and court intrigue. Naturally, with all this power, eunuchs didn't just fold their hands and hum lullabies. They schemed. One of the recurring dramas of Ottoman history is the rivalry between the chief black eunuch and the Grand Vizier. The vizier was the official head of government, but the eunuch controlled the sultan's private household, which meant the vizier might make laws, but the eunuch could control who whispered to the sultan at night. Add the sultan's mother into the mix, called the Valid Sultan, and you had a political triangle where the chief eunuch was often the deciding voice. Some historians argued that the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries was as much a rule of eunuchs and mothers as it was a rule of sultans. Bashir Aga, the most famous of them all. Let's drift for a moment to the 18th century to meet Bashir Aga. He's probably the most famous of all Ottoman eunuchs. Bashir Aga served for decades as the chief black eunuch under multiple sultans. He became fabulously wealthy, owned estates, patronized scholars, and even played a key role in promoting Islamic reform movements. He was described as intelligent, cunning, and deeply influential. When sultans came and went, sometimes poisoned, sometimes overthrown, Bashir Aga stayed. He was the palace constant. Imagine being the quiet figure who outlives rulers, reforms, wars, and still has the same set of palace keys jingling on your belt. The irony of influence. It's almost ironic. Eunuchs were supposed to be safe. They couldn't start dynasties. They weren't a military threat. They were designed to be loyal servants. And yet, in empire after empire, the people who tried to design loyalty ended up creating new centers of power. In the Ottoman case, eunuchs became central to the entire dynastic machine. They weren't just servants, they were kingmakers, estate managers, political brokers. And yet, like in Byzantium and China, their legacy was strangely hollow. They held immense power, but only for a time. When they died, their wealth was often confiscated, their names faded, and history shrugged, moving on to the next chief eunuch. The daily life, not all glamour. Now, before we drift too far into imagining eunuchs as all-powerful puppeteers, let's remember that most eunuchs in the Ottoman palace weren't Bashir Aga. Most were low-ranking attendants who lived in cramped quarters, performed endless duties, and never got near the levers of power. They carried trays, guarded doors, polished tiles, ran errands. Their lives were hard, their bodies marked by trauma, and their rewards limited. For every powerful eunuch at the top, there were hundreds, maybe thousands, whose lives passed in quiet obscurity, their stories unrecorded. The whispering legacy. So, in the Ottoman world, eunuchs weren't just a footnote. They were a vital part of palace culture, bridging the gap between the sultan, his harem, his court, and his empire. But like elsewhere, their influence came wrapped in irony. The men who were supposed to be powerless became powerful. The men who could not have heirs shaped the heirs of empires. And the men who were mutilated to ensure loyalty
often became the least trustworthy figures in the palace. Let's pause here. In the candlelit chambers of Topkapi Palace, the Bosporus whispering outside, while black-robed eunuchs shuffle silently through the corridors. In Part 5, we'll drift into the final act of this long story. What happened when eunuchs finally began to disappear from history? From the fall of the Ottomans to the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the age of the eunuchs came to a strangely quiet end. But not yet. Let's stay in the Ottoman twilight for just a little longer.
So, we've seen the eunuchs at their height. Generals, admirals, chamberlains, kingmakers, and gatekeepers of harems. But like all human systems, the age of the eunuchs wasn't eternal. By the modern period, their role began to shrink, until eventually they vanished. And the end was not dramatic, not some grand finale, more like a slow fading out, the way an old candle burns down to nothing, leaving just smoke curling in the air. The Ottoman decline. Let's linger first in the Ottoman Empire, where eunuchs had been so central to palace life. By the 19th century, the Ottoman state was desperately trying to modernize. European powers were knocking at the door with ironclads, railways, and new ideas about bureaucracy. And the sultans realized, perhaps reluctantly, that relying on a class of castrated men to run the empire wasn't exactly cutting edge. Reforms known as the Tanzimat swept through the 1800s, and with them, the role of eunuchs began to shrink. The harem itself, once the beating heart of dynastic intrigue, became less central. By the time the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, eunuchs were little more than ceremonial holdovers. The last chief black eunuch, recorded in the early 20th century, lived to see the Sultanate abolished in 1922. After that, the palace was turned into a museum. Imagine spending your life guarding secrets in shadowed corridors, only to watch tourists wander through with guidebooks a decade later. The Qing dynasty, a slow goodbye. Meanwhile, over in China, the eunuch system lasted even longer. The Forbidden City was still buzzing with eunuchs well into the 19th century. In fact, by the late Qing dynasty, there were still thousands of them shuffling around in silk robes, keeping up old routines even as the empire collapsed around them. The last emperor of China, Puyi, grew up surrounded by eunuchs in the early 20th century. He later recalled how they managed everything in the palace, from food to rituals to, most disturbingly, extortion. By then, many eunuchs had turned to petty corruption just to survive. They sold access, stole treasures, and squeezed bribes from desperate officials. When the Qing dynasty fell in 1911, the eunuchs weren't immediately dismissed. Puyi was allowed to live in the Forbidden City until 1924, and during that time, he was still served by palace eunuchs. The very last known imperial eunuch was Sun Yaoting. Born in 1902, he was castrated as a boy so his family could try to get him a palace job. He did become a eunuch, but by then, the empire was collapsing. He lived until 1996. Yes, 1996, giving interviews to historians in his old age. He recalled his lonely life, his regrets, and how he had spent decades after the fall of the Qing dynasty scraping by, forgotten by history. It's strange to think about, but the age of eunuchs ended not in some distant medieval century, but in living memory. The disappearance of an institution. Why did eunuchs disappear? A mix of reasons. Medicine advanced, and societies grew less comfortable with the brutality of castration. Dynasties collapsed, and with them the palace harems where eunuchs had been so essential. Western influence pushed ideas of modern bureaucracies and armies where castrated servants seemed archaic. And perhaps most of all, the world shifted toward new ideas of privacy, marriage, and gender. The whole system of let's keep thousands of concubines locked in a palace and guarded by eunuchs just didn't fit the modern age. It's almost comical when you think about it. One of the world's oldest job descriptions, royal eunuch, simply became obsolete.
like a typewriter repairman, but with more trauma. The emotional weight. For all the power eunuchs wielded, their personal stories are often tinged with sadness. Many were forced into the role as children, their futures decided for them in an instant. For every Bashir Aga or Zheng He, there were thousands who lived in quiet servitude, never rising above obscurity. Even the powerful ones carried a strange emptiness. No dynasties, no descendants, no family line. Their power was enormous, but temporary, and when they died, it evaporated. Sun Yaoting, that last eunuch of China, once said he felt his life had been wasted, that he had been mutilated for a system that no longer existed, and all he had left were memories of rituals and palaces that meant nothing to the new world. It's a reminder that history systems aren't just curiosities. They're built on human lives, often sacrificed for the convenience of rulers.
The legacy today. Today, eunuchs live on mostly as curiosities in history books, or as stock characters in novels and dramas about empires past. The word itself carries shadows of cruelty and strangeness. But their legacy is also a reminder of how societies once solved problems, sometimes brutally, often ironically. Kings wanted loyalty and trust, so they created eunuchs, and in doing so, they created an entire class of people who became powerful, indispensable, and sometimes more dangerous than the rivals they were meant to replace. That irony is what keeps their story compelling. The last whisper. So here, at the end of our long drift through palaces and harems, through Byzantium and Beijing, we come to silence. The eunuchs are gone. Their offices are gone. Their palaces are now museums. Their harems empty. What remains is the whisper of their presence, the knowledge that for thousands of years, some of the most powerful men in history were men who had been cut off, reshaped, and remade into something society thought would be safe. But as history shows, nothing is ever that simple. And with that, the tale of the eunuchs comes to rest. You can let it fade in your mind now, like a candle flickering out. The night is long, but history is always longer.